For 2 years, those who made their way to the Swiss town of Klein-Schneideck with a pair of binoculars, one could take a look at the gruesome spectacle before them. Hanging from the north face of the Eiger, known as the world's toughest climb, was the body of a man, swaying slightly in the wind in the summer and frozen to the rocks in the winter. But with more questions than answers and even less proof of the claim, fellow mountaineers and complete strangers began to tell their own tale. There was a group of 4, and they didn't belong here. The dangling man could have been helped, but others refused. Or maybe it was one who refused. And maybe it was one who pushed the other 2 to their deaths after stealing their gear when they didn't agree. The dangling man's partner must be a killer. Or so that's what they say.
Wow.
Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I'm your host, Kayla, and Anne is back.
This is the first time we've been on the clock. I feel pressure.
You haven't done an episode with me since you had Ren, right?
No, I haven't.
It's been a while. Okay.
I was in my 3rd trimester, so it's been at least 8-9 months.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll call it my maternity leave from podcasting.
Yeah, it was a little longer than I anticipated, but... Okay, so I was originally planning for this episode to come out on November 6th. It was going to be a subscriber exclusive, but I may or may not have an episode for this next week because I had a microphone malfunction again a second time this month. And the last episode that I recorded is not usable. And so we're going to re-record it, but we will be re-recording it right like the day before it releases.
Ooh,
and so
that's pressure.
Just in case anything goes wrong, I'm inserting this intro or this information because I want to have it in the event I need it. So the long version to get to where I'm getting to right now is basically I want to say thank you to all of my subscribers. There's several of you on Apple who I cannot see who they are because Apple likes their privacy. So everyone who subscribed on Apple, thank you so much. I've got a few Patreon subscribers. I want to thank you as well. And then there's also Spotify now has a subscription service. So if anybody uses Spotify instead and they want to sign up there, you're welcome to. Subscribers are now getting monthly episodes that are exclusive to them. So
that's cool.
Yeah, you get an extra episode. It's the first episode of each month, and I've also got some fun ideas for next year coming. I gotta do quite a bit of work on them though, so they're gonna be not starting in January, but like special series and whatnot are coming. So if you're interested, check out those options. Join us. You won't be disappointed. Okay, so we are going to be talking about the Eiger, which is a mountain in the Bernese Alps. And the first time that the north face of the Eiger was attempted to be climbed was in 1935. This first expedition, there were 6 people who attempted the climb. All of them died.
Oh my gosh.
The following expedition, or I guess I should say the following expeditions, the death rate was 50%. And this is a really daunting number to wrap your mind around, and therefore led to the nickname of the wall being the murderous wall. The fact that more people died climbing on the Eiger than made it to the top is slightly sobering, but for the right person or people is also very enticing because it is a very dangerous climb that can be conquered. Mm-hmm. And it takes the right personality to get in there. And clearly there are people with the right personalities because they continue to try it.
It's a special form of personality. It's the type of personality that you look at and you're like really excited when they actually do it and conquer it. Because it's like, yeah, go you. But at the same time, you wonder what kind of mindset they're in when they decide to conquer the death wall.
Yeah. Lots of questions, but it's really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool to even attempt. I personally would not ever attempt anything that had murder or death in the name of it or its nickname. But that's just me.
Yeah.
I like the safety of my own bubble where I'm at. So, of course, today the climb is not as deadly, and that's mostly because there's new climbing techniques and essentially better prepared climbers. Mm-hmm. So instead of people having to figure out how to get up this wall all on their own, there's already routes kind of laid out and people can figure out how to get where they're going based on what has previously been laid.
Natural routes, or have they actually like put in any type of...
There's some gear that's left behind.
Okay.
And which is something that comes into play in this particular story.
Got it. I would want to know who actually laid it, though, because if the person that laid a couple of them ends up dying, that might not be the safest route to go.
That's a fair observation, one that I did not think about.
It's like, oh, clearly somebody must have used this, and then you realize that there's no more once you get like halfway up and that person...
Because that person fell. And they weren't able to put any more up. Yeah, that's a valid.
Somebody should put some red flags on those.
Yeah. Tie a little red string. Don't go here.
Yeah.
So the peak sits on the Bernese Oberland region of Switzerland, and this area is surrounded by picturesque lakes. Sharp peaks create a contrast that even the most well-traveled people loved. So like Switzerland mountain town, like you can Google very easily and like pull up picture upon picture of just beautiful looking places.
Oh yeah.
The location is just north of Italy and just east of France, and the Eiger sits on the Alpine region and within a mountain range that spreads across 8 countries in Europe, spanning 750 miles or 12,000 kilometers. This mountain range started its formation when the tectonic plates of Eurasia and Africa collided roughly 30 million years ago. The Eiger reaches 13,015 feet or 3,967 meters in elevation, and it also is known as the Org, the Eigerwand, and Eiger Norwand. In the 3 mountains that make up this southeastern side of the Bernese Alps mountain range, the Eiger is one of them. The Monk and Jungfrau are the other 2. It is said that, mythologically speaking, of course, that the Monk will guard the Virgin from the Org. So the Eiger is the Org, Jungfrau is the Virgin, and the Monk is the Monk. If you needed that clarified.
That's interesting.
So in addition to this, there's also mythological winds that show up from the south, which are called ferns. And this translates to hairdryer. And these winds are said to sweep across the face, surprising climbers with harsh, warm winds and vicious storms.
Well, I mean, I was okay with the warm part. I mean, harsh, cold winds would be rough.
The warm is probably great because the north face specifically of the Eiger doesn't get a whole lot of sun. Like in the best conditions, the maximum amount of sun you get each day is an hour.
Ooh.
So it's very cold, very wet.
There's nothing about this that is appealing for myself.
I agree. So specifically, the north face of the Eiger is a vertical mile of limestone and black ice, which makes up the largest north-facing rock in the Alps. And it is, quote unquote, among the most deadly. But I think it's arguably especially in the time that we are talking about, which is in the 50s, probably the most deadly.
Wow.
Part of the reason that the north face of the Eiger is so deadly is because the combination of the face is very exposed to weather, and since the weather comes in from typically the northwest, it tends to get hit by more severe storms, which creates a perfect combination for more frequent avalanches, along with ice and rock that are easily collapsed. Man. In addition to this, especially in like the more current years where we're seeing like this general warm up of the earth, that ice and those ice fields are starting to melt and go away. And so what used to be stable ice that they could climb on is now essentially crumbling limestone. And so while it is generally safer than it used to be to climb the Eiger, there's still a lot of collapsing rock that climbers have to deal with.
Yeah, I was going to say, depending on the season.
Yeah.
I mean, the slush is not going to be stable.
Oh, for sure.
Like, I mean, if it already melted off and it was solid rock, then obviously that might make it a little bit more stable. Or if it was cold enough that the ice was still solid and you could pick it. But man, if it shifts even just a little bit.
Yeah. And because all of this like deterioration has been happening, stuff from underneath ledges is falling away rather than like stuff on top of ledges is falling away. That's creating overhangs that you now have to maneuver over. And it's not really like the ledges aren't getting any wider. They're not getting any more, I don't want to say sturdy, but they're not providing any more of a resting spot for climbers. But there's a lot more overhangs now that they have to climb over. And so there's, again, this is a vertical mile of wall that you don't really have a whole lot of ledges coming down, but you got a whole lot of overhangs going up. And so if you fall, you don't know when you're going to stop. You know when you're going to stop. It's at the bottom. It's not, the ledges likely aren't going to catch you unless you're ropes, because you're roped in and everything holds. Then you'll stop when your rope gets to its length.
Yeah.
Which is another unappealing idea.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm also kind of a person that likes to stay close to the ground. And so,
fair.
You know, me and rock climbing, it's fun.
Oh, yeah.
I won't say I'm great at it.
Oh, no, I'm not either.
I'm like, you know, kiddie pool when it comes to rock climbing.
Sam and I, we went last week and we just did the bouldering. So like you're already like relatively close to the ground. Like you can fall and you might get injured, but you're probably going to be fine.
Yeah.
And there was this one part that was like, there was like a little bit of like a angle to the wall. So that way you were kind of like climbing, like you really had to work to like keep your body close to the wall.
Sure.
Because gravity just wants to pull you down. And then like once you got like past like basically 5 foot, it was straightened out again. And so I am notoriously bad with those angles. I just can't figure out how to get myself wedged in there. Like I'm strong enough. I know that I am. I just haven't figured out the coordination of it. And I was like, okay, I'll be happy if I get both of my hands on that tall section. And I did. I got there. And then like the next rock up or the next hold up was like too high for me to get. And so then I was like, okay, I can swing and get there. But then by then my grip was so trashed that I was like, if I let go with either one of my hands, I'm falling. And so then I was like, okay, fine. Like I'll just drop down. And then for whatever reason, my mind completely blanked at how far up I was. And I was like, okay. And like I let go and my feet were like 6 inches from the ground. But in my head, I was several feet off the ground and I like just like grabbed onto the rock and I was like, oh no, I can't do it.
I would do the same thing.
And so then like I ended up like dropping down and I was like, oh, that was it. Cool. Got it.
Love it. Yeah. But that's the mindset that I have coming into this too, where it's like, you know, I'm 6 inches off the ground and, you know, scared. So I can't even imagine like a full mile. And this is on top.
No, thank you.
Of an actual mountain. Yeah. Like this isn't like a mile up from the ground. A mile up from the ground still would not be a fun fall. But
no.
Yeah. So how do you even get to the bottom of this thing? Can you hike in?
Yeah, we will talk a little bit about that. It is highly recommended that when you climb the north face of the Eiger that you know exactly the route that you plan to take. You study the landmarks, you know exactly where you are going, because the rocks collapse and shift so much that, I mean, it's not like a major amount, but like over time, landmarks start to look different than what they did a couple of years prior. And so if you don't really know where you're going, you don't know where you're going. You're going to get lost. You're going to get off track. And this is, generally speaking, a pretty standard way to climb, is to study the location you're going to. You know the route up. You know alternate routes in case something is blocked off and it's not safe. You know descent routes. You know where you can bail and where you can't bail. Like, that's pretty standard when somebody's going on some sort of expedition, to know where they're going.
At least that kind of answers my question from earlier about, like, you know, some of the things that other climbers have left behind.
Yes.
So
if it's been climbed, you can usually find it, right? And like be able to, I mean, I think most people in the community are like pretty open about like, yeah, I climbed this, let me sit down and we can talk about like what I did, where I think it could have been better, where I made mistakes. Like,
yeah,
I think that's, in general, people want other people to succeed.
Do we know how many people have actually succeeded in climbing this?
I don't know how many people have succeeded, but I do know that to date, over 60 people have died trying to climb the Eiger. Between the years that the first attempt was made in 1935 and 1957, which is when this story takes place, any and all rescue attempts had failed, and it became a known condition that when you attempted to climb the Eiger, you either succeeded or you died. Nobody was coming to get you.
Wow.
So, interestingly, the Eiger is not far separated from society. And so there's a ski resort that sits at the base of the mountain called Jungfrau Ski Resort. There's a 1-hour train ride from Klein-Schneideck to get to the ski resort. And then there's also a hostel nearby that climbers can stay at and start their climb essentially from the hostel.
Nice.
So there's a community there, especially in like the winter months when there's skiing and whatnot going on. There was once a train track that led a tunnel through the Eiger as well. And when they were constructing it, they came too close to the wall and accidentally busted through the wall.
Gosh.
And because everything seemed to be like really stable and really sound, they turned it into viewing balconies. So that way the train would stop and you could get off and look down at the valley from the wall of the Eiger.
That's a happy accident.
Yeah. And then this was actually they changed the balcony from being like open air to glass walls. And this ended up getting closed down in 2016 because there was a newer and faster rail system going through the mountains and they just weren't using it anymore. And this worked out really well though, because some climbers started to realize that they could get in through the windows. And so they would just, you know, instead of staying the night on the actual face of the wall, they would go in and climb into those balconies and just stay the night there. Or if there was severe weather, they could get there, they would. Like, it was a happy accident.
Yeah.
On August 3rd, 1957, 2 Italians decided to try to see if they could become the first Italians to climb the north face of the Eiger. Claudio Corti and Stefano Longhi were both members of a prestigious climbing group in Italy known as the Lecco Spiders. This group is well known around the world for making difficult descents, and so it was no surprise when the Eiger came up as a potential climb. Claudio was 29 years old and was probably the more experienced of the 2 climbers, even though Stefano was older at 44 years. Arguably, even though Stefano was a member of this prestigious group, he was one of the weaker climbers. But a weak climber that was a member of this group is still a very good, very strong climber.
Sure.
It was just, you know, as in this group of people, he was one of like the newer, less experienced climbers.
He's still in the top 1%.
Yeah, but you're still a part of this prestigious group. So like you're not a bad climber. You're just not as I guess well-traveled as some of the others have been. This group actively seeks out the best climbs and mountaineers in order to make a name for itself in the ascent of really big mountains. So that again lays into Stefano might not have been the best, but he was still a part and still among the best. With their background and knowledge and membership with this really high valued group, the pair, for whatever reason, decided not to really plan what they were doing when it came to the Eiger. Their hope had been that they would find a trail of pitons, which they're essentially metal spikes that have a hole in them that you can drill into a mountain as you go up. They're usually left behind for routes, so that way people can just like clip their carabiners onto it and continue going. It's kind of like a low impact way of creating a trail up the side of a mountain. So because they were hoping to just follow somebody else's route up, they didn't bring a route description with them. Because of this, their first 2 days on the wall was literally looking for the route.
I love doing these podcasts with you because I come totally unprepared. And when you start telling me these things, like I'm going back to my earlier question of like, how would you know which pitons were successful and not successful? But then you told me information about how, you know, people actually study the paths before they get out there.
And so you would like to know.
So I breathed a little bit like, oh, you know, they probably blocked some of these off or something.
Yeah.
Now I feel like you're about to tell me, since they didn't plan, that they got into all sorts of trouble by following somebody else's pitons.
Oh, you're in for a ride. So, yeah, that's one of the good things I think about like people not knowing what they're getting themselves into, because it's like your reactions are genuine.
Yeah, my Sam, he asked me, he goes, well, what's this one about, when I was actually coming to do the podcast? And I was like, I have no idea. I like going on completely unprepared so that way I can be totally shocked when she tells me a crazy tale.
Yeah. Well, so as they, you know, finally find the route and they finally get climbing, they're day 3 in and they're only a third of the way up the wall. And in this time frame, it was not unusual for the climb to take several days.
Okay.
And so there was nothing to really be like alarmed about at this point. Like, you know, they were on the route for 3 days. They were a third of the way up. That sounds pretty good. Like if you get a third of the way up, it's going to take you 9 total days to get to the top. Might be a couple days longer than what is average for this time frame, but it's not alarming. Today, it takes 2 days. Unless you're like really eager and you want to do one full push, then it's usually like around 20-hour mark. But most people split it into 2 days where they climb a portion of the day, sleep on the face, and then do the remaining of the climb. So they're a third of the way up the wall and they end up seeing 2 climbers approaching them. These 2 climbers were Gunther Nothdorft and Franz Mayer. Both Gunther and Franz were 2022. Both Gunther and Franz were 20. Oh my God. They're 22 years old.
I love editing.
Oh God, get it out, Kayla. Both Gunther and Franz were 22.
They were 22 years old.
They were 22 years old. I'm not going to edit this part out. I'll snip some of it out, but they're both 22 years old and they were among the top alpinists in Germany. Like they were very good at what they did. So the Italians and Germans kind of end up on the same line because they're climbing the same route. And they decide that they are going to climb together. And even though they kind of like stayed separate and climbed on their own separate lines, they were climbing together, which was really good because the 2 Germans, Gunther and Franz, knew the route that they needed to take. And so all Claudio and Stefano had to do was follow their route up the Eiger.
Interesting.
By the end of day 4, they had just made it past the halfway point, but it was during the night that the Italians would be able to pay the Germans back for their knowledge on the route, because as they slept, the Germans' bag of food slipped from where they were sleeping, and in the morning, the Germans awoke and had no food left.
Wow.
So Claudio was very quick to say, hey, we have food. We will gladly share with you guys. Like, clearly, that's a unfortunate situation. You don't really want it to happen, but it did. But again, as a reminder, this food was already less than what it should have been because Claudio and Stefano spent 2 days looking for the route when they could have been climbing up the wall. Either way, in addition to this, they were knowingly climbing extremely slow. By the 5th day, they were just now entering the last third of the climb. And while this was still kind of quote unquote on track for how long it would typically take, they themselves knew that they were going really slow. And in addition to this, there were bystanders in the valley that were watching them through binoculars, and they could see that they were making progress. And so everyone in the valley was like, they're still doing great. They're still making it up the wall. They're moving. They're going. The teams were slowing down, and in this top third of the climb, there was a 3-pitch section that should have taken them 1 day to get through. Instead, it took them 2 days. And Stefano was becoming more and more tired, and he was suffering from frostbite, which was making the movements of his hands and his feet extremely difficult. And he couldn't tell if he was getting a good hold anywhere or not. And so his hands were slipping, his feet were slipping, and he was just really struggling at this point. In addition to this, Gunther was starting to feel the effects of altitude sickness and was really just feeling bad the entire time. The bystanders could see when the movement stopped. From the valley, they could see 3 men collected towards the top of a pitch, and then there was a 4th that was almost the entire length of rope below. They quickly guessed that the man at the bottom had fallen and had climbed onto a narrow ridge, and that he was just trying to figure out how to get back up to the rest of the group. This person who had fallen was Stefano, and he actually, in the fall, broke his leg. So Claudio, Gunther, and Franz didn't have the strength or the leverage to physically pull him up to where they were. And so they knew that their best chances to save their friend was to reach the top and then get down to the valley so that way they could launch a rescue. And so that's what they decided. They were going to abandon Stefano momentarily and keep climbing. From the valley, the spectators correctly assumed that one had fallen and then saw the 3 start to climb again. It was then that the trio was at about 1,000 feet or 300 meters from the summit when the people in the valley lost their view because fog and clouds started to roll in. On the face, Claudio, Gunther, and Franz all heard a sudden rumble. Gunther and Franz leaned hard against the wall and sheltered their heads with their arms, and Claudio processed what was happening just seconds too late. He had looked up as the rocks above them had collapsed and were now raging down the face towards them.
Oh, man.
Gunther and Franz were hit, but luckily unharmed. But Claudio was knocked away from the rest of the group, and he fell about 60 feet down to a ledge. And at this point, he had a gash in his head, and he couldn't keep climbing. Gunther and Franz then lowered their tent down on a rope to Claudio. Claudio sent his climbing gear back up to the 2 Germans, and it was now up to Gunther and Franz to climb to the summit, retreat down the ridge, and get help for both Claudio and Stefano.
Wow.
Down in the valley, though, through the fog, bystanders could locate Stefano and Claudio, but not the other 2. In the valley with them was Swiss alpinist Paul Seiler, and he knew trouble when he saw it, and he was immediate in his decision to launch a rescue. Paul went straight to the Swiss Alpine Club's Grinwald Rescue Section, which is where the Eiger fell into in the world of search and rescue in the Swiss Alps. And they were like, nope, we're not helping you. Like, people already know that if they get onto the Eiger, we're not helping anyone dumb enough to try that dangerous climb. Like,
wow.
They're on their own. So Paul was like, screw you guys. And he calls his friend Eric Friendly, who was an expert in mountain rescue. And Eric assembled a 21-man team to come help. It didn't stop there, though. Lionel Terry, who was an alpinist, and then Ludwig Graminger, who was the head of the Munich Mountain Guide Rescue, both offered their help, and it was quickly accepted. And then finally, a group of Polish climbers who were in the area training for an expedition in the Himalayas offered to help as well. So in all, there were 50 men who gathered together to assist in the rescue of these 4 climbers. They had no idea how they were going to get to the men, what equipment they might need, or how they were going to get whatever equipment they decided they were going to use up to the summit. But they didn't have the time to sit and discuss what to do, for the clouds and fog were a precursor for a storm that was rolling in, and it was coming fast and it was coming hard. Those stepping into the shoes as rescuers knew at this point that the minutes counted. Part of the group boarded a train and went to the pass that was between the peaks of Jungfrau and the Monk, and then they proceeded with a 2-mile or 3.2 kilometer hike to the summit. The rest of the group climbed the 6,000 foot or 1,800 meter west flank of the Eiger, which is also considered the standard descent route. Mm-hmm. And so this route is really well known. It's really well traveled. Like, it's very easy to follow that path. After 8 days on the wall, both Claudio and Stefano were alive, but barely holding on. Unfortunately, by the time the people in the valley were able to get a sight of them, they could only see the 2 Italians and still not able to locate the 2 Germans. So they assumed the Germans must have got to the summit and were probably on their way down at the same time that these rescuers were on their way up. The team who took the train, anchoring winch system with them, and they were the first ones on the scene, and they started setting up this winch immediately.
What is an anchoring winch?
So it's basically a winch that can be anchored to the ground, and then you can send a cable down the side of the face of this mountain.
Got it.
And then use the winch to pull the people back up.
Got it.
So Paul Seiler was the one who initiated the search. He was the first one to hook himself onto the cable and started working his way down, but they figured out that the winch had been set up to lower 200 feet or 61 meters too far to the west. So it's really important to make sure that when a winch is set up, that it's in the correct position to be able to generate enough power to pull these guys back up.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just as simple as him climbing 200 feet to the east to get to where they thought Claudio was. He had to climb all the way back up, and they had to change the orientation of the winch in order to know that they would produce enough power to rescue these guys. And so essentially what they were going to have to do was have someone go down, get to the person, put the person into a harness, then take that harness and strap it to themselves, and then the winch would pull the 2 of them back up.
Wow.
So Paul comes back up, and they reposition the winch, and this time Eric Friendly hooked in and started down and figured out that they were, again, still too far to the west. As Eric was coming back up, the second group met them at the summit, and this time they set up their winch in the correct location. Again, because the rock is not always the most reliably stable on the Eiger, they were using others as human dead man anchors, which essentially means that they were acting as anchors and were holding onto ropes that were tied to the winches to act as a safety net in case the rock beneath the winch broke away.
Gracious.
At about 9 a.m., Alfred Hellepart was 750 feet or 225 meters down the cable and got to where they assumed someone was, since there was a red bivouac tent. He was correct. And here, Claudio stuck his head out of the tent and asked Alfred if he had any food. Alfred only had a chocolate bar with him and happily handed it over. And Claudio was so hungry that he shoved the entire bar in his mouth without taking the wrapper off.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not entirely sure if he consumed the wrapper.
Or pulled it out.
Or if it was like, my teeth are sharper and faster than my hands will be, especially at that point. I'm sure his fingers were probably frostbitten and probably not feeling super great. And so he might have just had the mental consciousness to know that like my teeth are the most reliable way for me to get into this candy bar very fast.
Yeah.
And then just pulled the wrapper out as needed. I'm not sure. I'm going to assume that he pulled the wrapper out, but I could be wrong.
I don't know. I mean, I've thankfully never been that hungry before in my life, but
you might not care.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
yeah.
And maybe
it's something, get it in my system.
Yeah.
So Alfred noticed at this point that the entire ledge that he had been on within arm's reach was completely cleaned of snow and ice. So this was because Claudio was attempting to get as much liquid as he could. And so he was shoving his face into the crevices of the rocks to suck snow, ice, and water away and consume it. But with doing this, so the rock fall, when it came down on him, it chipped some of his teeth.
Oh.
And in addition to how he was getting the snow and getting it from like the small crevices, it was chipping his teeth more. So his teeth were really jagged at this point. It took about an hour, but Alfred finally got Claudio into his safety harness, attached the harness to himself, and then gave the cue to be pulled up. This section of the Eiger was not quite at a vertical angle, which required Alfred to, as he was being pulled by the winch, walk up the rock face with Claudio attached to his back.
Wow.
This took 59 minutes, and they arrived at the summit of the Eiger, and with it, it became the first official successful rescue in the Eiger's history. But there were still 3 men who needed to be accounted for, and as they discussed how to go about reaching Stefano, they came to the daunting realization that the winch was pretty much at its capacity with rescuing Claudio. Stefano was likely 300 feet or 91 meters, maybe more, past where Claudio was found. Mm-hmm. And so, in short, the winch was not able to manage the longer lengths of the cable, and it wasn't producing enough power that they would be able to pull up 2 men. And they were worried that if they sent someone down, it would potentially strand a second man on the face, because they were worried at that length that it wouldn't generate enough power to help pull one person up.
Got it.
So again, there's also a storm coming in, and those who were in this responsible party were just not willing to risk any of their healthy people. And the entire time that they're like having this conversation and trying to figure out what to do and figure out their options for getting down to Stefano, they had put Claudio into a snow hole at the summit, and Claudio is declining rapidly at this point. One of the men finally realizes that Claudio is not responsive and starts the evacuation process, where a team would essentially carry him down the west side of the mountain, which is a mile long or almost 2 kilometers. But because of the time they finally started to do this, the storm was blowing in. They only made it about a quarter of that distance before realizing that they would have to dig in to the snow, create another snow cave, and wait to descend the following day in the daylight. This means that Claudio would have to spend a total of 10 days and 9 nights on the mountain. He luckily made it off the following day and was taken to a hospital in Interlaken, where he miraculously lived and was able to make a full recovery.
Wow.
In his 9 days on the Eiger, he lost 44 pounds or 20 kilometers. 20 kilograms. Unfortunately,
same thing.
It's close enough. Unfortunately, the following morning, when everyone began to check to see if they could locate Stefano and determine a rescue plan for him, they could see that his body was stiff and that he was no longer clinging to the ridge, but instead swaying in the winds that tore across the face.
Oh.
Because of this really precarious nature of the Eiger's wall, north face, they decided that they weren't going to try to recover his body. It was just too risky to send anyone down and reliably get them back up.
Wow.
And with no leads on where the Germans were, the rescue was called off. 2 years later, in 1959, a Dutch newspaper paid a group of professional Swiss guides to climb up to the summit, lower down on their own, and retrieve Stefano from the face of the Eiger, which they did successfully.
Oh.
Immediately, though, from Claudio's rescue and on, everyone blamed Claudio for the death of Stefano, Gunther, and Franz. Not just because he survived, but because some thought that he had pushed the others to their deaths. Why? I don't know. That's a great question. The stories that ranged in variety of truth and lies spread far, but not just in the news. There were books as well, such as The White Spider. And The White Spider is actually now known to be the least accurate representation of what the four had encountered. So these stories often went off of the poor interpretation of Claudio's answers while he was in the hospital. And this was because...
Was he delirious?
No. So there was a Swiss writer by the name of Guido Tonella who was self-proclaimed fluent in Italian.
Oh.
He was not actually fluent in Italian.
Oh, gosh.
He was also a reporter, and while in the hospital, he decided that he was Claudio's translator. So you might be able to see immediately what the problem is, but this man who claimed to be able to speak both Swiss and Italian, who was a reporter, was allowing all of these other reporters to come in and ask Claudio questions. So he would then ask the question to Claudio from Swiss to Italian in his not fluent Italian. Claudio would then answer the question that not fluent Italian was being asked. And then the person who was, again, not fluent in Italian was relaying that information back to these other Swiss
Poor Claudio.
reporters. So he was in a really twisted way because it didn't come out right away that Guido was not fluent in Italian. He became a really reliable and consistent and credible source of information because he knew Italian and he was getting these answers directly from Claudio, who is Italian. So,
my gosh,
we now know.
What a different time, the 1950s.
Right?
That guy would have been eaten alive on social media if he would have tried to pull a stunt like that now.
Yeah.
When did the true story come out?
That's a complicated answer, and we'll get to it.
Got it.
So we already know that he's not as fluent as he thought he was in Italian, which led to miscommunications that only fed rumors. Further, some of the writers who came into question Claudio were climbers of the 30s who were under the guise that if you needed a rescue, you were a disgrace to the climbing community.
What?
So one Italian climber and writer, Riccardo Cason, stepped into the room and started yelling at him that he abandoned Stefano because he was a coward and that the need for a rescue brought shame to the Italian climbers. And then a second Italian climber came in by the name of Carlo Mari, and he pretty much did the same thing. We will later discover that both Riccardo and Carlo were in the Swiss Alps because they intended to be the first Italians to climb the exact same route that Claudio and Stefano had attempted. And they were basically upset that Claudio and Stefano almost stole the title of the first Italian ascent of the north face of the Eiger from them. And so they were just mad. However, they would not become the first to climb the north face for the Italians, as the victory would not be claimed until 5 years later in 1962. So this barrage did not diminish once Claudio was out of the hospital. The media claimed that Claudio knew more than what he was telling. Both Germany and Switzerland media were calling him a murderer and that he clearly killed the Germans and stole their gear. To them, their claim was supported by the fact that Claudio had received a head wound from either the rocks falling or in his fall. They saw this wound as being from an axe that one of the Germans had carried with them, and it signified that the Germans tried to defend themselves against Claudio, who attacked them. Claudio overcame them, stole their gear, and then pushed them off the face of the mountain, and then down climbed to pretend to be injured and need rescued.
Wow.
So once Stefano's body was recovered, an autopsy was done, and this in part helped to support Claudio's story, as this was when they discovered that he had broken his leg. But of course, there were some people who also twisted this, such as one Italian writer speculated that there was no way Stefano broke his leg in the fall because, quote unquote, broken legs cannot move. And many witnessed Stefano moving around on the wall and the ledge after his fall. And so he was like, broken legs cannot move, but he was moving.
What kind of theory is that?
Right? So, of course, we know better than to believe that now.
Yeah.
But this didn't help the situation for Claudio.
No.
And I think at the time, people were also trying to figure out where to lay blame. And because people were already ganging up on Claudio, it just became like, he's the scapegoat. Like, of course it's his fault. Finally, in 1961, a group of expeditioners found proof that Gunther and Franz were the official 14th summiters of the Eiger's north face. On the western ridge, their bodies were found frozen and toughened by the elements, positioned in a way and in a location that is compatible with them getting caught in an avalanche. So they made it to the top and started descending the western ridge and got pulled in by an avalanche.
Wow.
In addition to this, just like Claudio had explained, they had all of Claudio's climbing gear with them. So Claudio passed away at the age of 81 in 2010, and throughout the years, those who climbed with him were finally able to understand how he survived on the Eiger. His personality is not just described as strong, but unrelenting. It was almost as if his determination grew as the events became more difficult. Unfortunately for Claudio, some of the writers who either insinuated or outright claimed that he was the cause of death for his partners on the Eiger never took back their words. Some even doubled down on their claims, making this a lifelong difficulty that he would carry with him no matter where he went, especially in the non-climbing community, where the truth and understanding of what finding Gunther and Franz's bodies mean did not carry weight.
I mean, I'm not in the climbing community. Sometimes I just question people because, I mean...
Yeah. I'm also not in the climbing community, but why are we jumping? Like, why did we decide to jump down this guy's throat immediately?
Yeah.
Like, there was no reason for that. And I truly think it was somebody needed to blame someone.
Why is there ever blame? It was an accident. You know what I mean?
For sure.
It was unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah.
4 grown men decided to try and tackle this, great adventure. And it tragically did not work out for 3 of them. Actually, 2 of them made it, but then, got hit by an avalanche.
Yeah.
So just crazy.
It's like, looking at it, it's a really frustrating thing. And while I love the media and getting the fact that we have like the availability to get the truth out there in a free manner, it's also very hard sometimes to decipher between what is real and what is not. And when people present information as real,
or like they're a authority or some type of expert on the subject matter. Yeah,
it's really hard for people who are not in the space to question and be like, that's not real. Like,
right.
So like, of course, if this were to happen now, I think there would be people who are a little bit more renowned in the space that if they questioned it, it would give enough authority for people who are not in the space to be like, oh, maybe this isn't the real story. But if all of those people are like, yeah, this sounds like something that would happen on the Eiger and this happened and there's this evidence and everything else is missing, what other conclusion are you going to come to? I think it's extreme that they were like, oh, he clearly pushed these people to their death. Because in my never been to the Eiger experience, my thought process would be that if you push somebody off the north wall, which is a vertical mile on a very specific mountain, there's a base to it, which means you're probably going to find evidence of a body being at the base if that's where they were pushed.
Yeah, logically.
If there's no bodies at the base, like, you can't assume that they got pushed.
Yeah.
But
it is, I mean, it's interesting between like culturally now and then too, because I mean, that was a post World War II world. And so I feel like tensions were probably still there between cultures. And
probably.
So I'm just wondering what the media was doing during that time that they were trying to play into something or write a story about something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, because it doesn't logically make any sense to assume anything except an accident in the world that we live in today, but culturally it was so different.
It was a different
because this
world.
was almost 70 years ago.
Yeah.
At this point, so man.
Yeah. So
poor Claudio.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. So while some know him as among the best climbers, many more recognize him as a controversial climber. Despite the truth being known, Claudio never sat down and told the full story from his perspective, probably because he knew that he wouldn't be fully believed by those he spoke to, especially because of the book The White Spider, which again is the book that has the least accurate storyline in it.
Yeah.
And this is because it had been reprinted time and time again. The author passed away before any changes were made to the text, and the publisher just continued to print what he had written. They never put any disclaimers in it that said, you know, this information has been shown to be inaccurate. Mm-hmm. It was just portrayed as this is the truth. And it's all right here in this book. You just need to get it and read it.
You make more money that way.
You do make more money that way. So
it's so sad. It
is. But then as the truth was found, other accounts began to circulate, releasing Claudio from the accusations. In part, The Corti Drama and The Prisoner of the Eiger are both books that were released between 2003 and 2008, which relayed the amount of injustices that Claudio faced over these events. So,
man,
that is my story on the drama of the Eiger.
It just makes me sad because something that should have been like such a like woohoo, we saved one moment, like turned into
very
controversy.
First successful rescue ever on the Eiger.
Yeah,
turned into, but you saved a murderer.
Yeah,
but he really wasn't a murderer because he was literally just clinging to life.
Yeah, while
the other guys were also clinging to life. Like,
crazy.
Yeah, it is.
It's a great story.
It is. I've been holding on to that one for a little bit.
Yeah.
Just waiting for the right time.
The right moment to share.
Yeah. I've been sitting there like, okay, when am I going to have some free time? And I'll ask Anne.
Well, thanks for thinking of me.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Thanks for doing it with me.
Absolutely. Poor Claudio.
Poor Claudio.
I'm just going to keep saying poor Claudio.
That poor guy.
He didn't deserve that.
No. And well, I mean, it just like circles back to like, if you don't know, you're going to believe what's told to you, right? And so this Guido guy fucked it all up for him.
Do your research, people.
Do your research and don't say that you are fluent in a language that you are not fluent in.
No joke.
Okay, thanks.
The end.
What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.